In May 1945, Britain stood victorious. The war in Europe was over, German cities lay in ruins, the Nazi regime had collapsed. Across the British Isles, church bells rang, crowds filled the streets, and a nation that had endured 6 years of bombing, rationing, and fear finally allowed itself to breathe. On paper, Britain had won. It had fought longer than anyone else. It had stood alone when the rest of Europe fell. It had paid in blood, cities, and sacrifice. And it emerged on the winning side of the greatest conflict in human history. But victory hid a secret. The British Empire did not survive World War II. It just hadn't realized it yet. There was no surrender ceremony for the empire, no announcement, no single moment when it ended. Instead, it began dying the moment the war was won. Quietly, systematically, and almost invisibly. This is the story of how victory became defeat. When the war began, Britain was already weaker than it looked. The empire still covered vast territory, but its economic foundations had been eroding since the First World War. Britain had borrowed heavily to survive that earlier conflict and never fully recovered its financial dominance. World War II pushed the system past the point of return. To fight, Britain liquidated its overseas investments. It sold gold. It mortgaged future income. It stripped itself of assets built over centuries. Everything that could be turned into dollars was turned into dollars. Not to expand power, but to survive another month. The war was not just fought with tanks and aircraft, it was fought with balance sheets. Factories stopped producing exports and were converted entirely to weapons. Global markets were abandoned. Trade routes collapsed. The empire that once paid for itself stopped generating income and became a cost center overnight. And while Britain fought for survival, another power was growing stronger. The United States entered the war late, fought with untouched industry, and financed the conflict in a way Britain no longer could. American factories expanded. American banks accumulated gold. American influence spread quietly through contracts, loans, and logistics. By the time the fighting ended, the battlefield told one story. The ledgers told another. Britain had won the war, but it had lost the economic foundations that made the empire possible. The destruction did not come from defeat. It came from the price of victory. When the guns fell silent, Britain expected relief. After years of total war, there was an assumption that the worst was over, that peace would allow the country to recover, rebuild, and reclaim its place at the center of the world. Instead, peace exposed the damage. During the war, Britain had not merely spent money. It had dismantled the financial machinery that sustained empire. Overseas investments were gone. Gold reserves had been shipped abroad. The pound no longer anchored global trade. What remained was an economy optimized for survival, not prosperity. Exports were almost non-existent. British factories were exhausted, outdated, and poorly positioned to compete in peacetime markets. Cities were scarred by bombing. Infrastructure was worn down. Skilled labor had been consumed by years of war production. At the same time, the empire still demanded funding. Troops had to be paid, administrations maintained, shipping protected, bases supplied across continents. The empire had become a financial liability precisely when Britain could least afford it. The solution was supposed to be American support. During the war, Britain survived on lend-lease. Food, fuel, raw materials, and weapons flowed across the Atlantic, allowing Britain to fight without immediate payment. It created the illusion that victory would be followed by breathing room. That illusion shattered almost instantly. In August 1945, days after Japan surrendered, the United States terminated Lend-Lease without warning. The cutoff was immediate. Ships already at sea were ordered to turn around. Supplies Britain had assumed were guaranteed vanished overnight. Britain was bankrupt in peace. Without American financing, the country could not pay for food imports or raw materials. Rationing intensified instead of ending. Bread, which had never been rationed during the war, was rationed afterward. The population that expected reward for sacrifice received austerity instead. The government turned again to borrowing. The Anglo-American loan was presented as assistance, but it came with conditions that stripped away what little autonomy remained. Britain agreed to open its currency, dismantle trade protections, and accept rules designed for a system it no longer dominated. The pound was exposed, confidence evaporated, reserves drained. Every attempt to stabilize the economy required another compromise, another retreat, another acceptance of limits that would have been unthinkable before the war. Victory had not restored Britain's strength. It had revealed its weakness. The empire was still standing, but it was now unsupported. Every year it consumed resources Britain did not have. Every decision became an exercise in delay. The war had been won. The aftermath was being lost. The cost of holding the empire together rose just as Britain's ability to pay collapsed. In the past, colonies had generated revenue that flowed back to London. After the war, they demanded investment, security, and development. Britain was being asked to finance modernization at a moment when it could barely feed itself. India was the breaking point. During the war, India had accumulated enormous sterling balances. On paper, Britain owed India vast sums. In reality, it had no dollars to honor them. Allowing India to spend those balances freely would have drained Britain's remaining reserves in months. There were only two options: default or independence. Britain chose independence. The loss of India was not a sudden moral awakening. It was a financial decision. Without India, the empire could not function. With India, Britain would go bankrupt even faster. Once that precedent was set, the logic spread rapidly. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, the numbers no longer worked. Every colony represented a liability. Security costs rose, revenues fell, development demands increased. The empire that had once been self-financing was now hemorrhaging cash. At home, the strain deepened, and the government attempted to protect living standards through controls and rationing. But these measures suppressed growth. Industry stagnated. Innovation slowed. Britain fell further behind competitors who were rebuilding with fresh capital and modern infrastructure. The pound reflected the reality. In 1949, it was devalued. Overnight, imports became more expensive. The British public became poor relative to the rest of the world. It was an admission that the old economic model no longer worked. Every retreat reinforced the next. As Britain withdrew from one commitment, pressure increased elsewhere. The empire was unraveling, not because of rebellion alone, but because Britain could not afford to hold it together. Money, not ideology, was deciding the outcome. The irony was brutal. Britain had fought the war to preserve a global order it could no longer sustain. Victory accelerated the very forces that made empire impossible. By the early 1950s, the pattern was clear. Britain could either invest in domestic recovery or subsidize global control. It could not do both. Each year of delay made the choice starker. Winning the war had destroyed the margin that once made empire viable. The empire survived the fighting. It did not survive the peace. The final blow came when Britain tried to act like a superpower one last time. By the mid-1950s, the empire still existed on maps, but its ability to enforce its will depended entirely on money it no longer controlled. The illusion of independence remained. The financial reality did not. The Suez Crisis exposed this gap to the world. When Britain, alongside France, moved to regain control of the canal in 1956, it was meant to demonstrate that Britain still mattered. Militarily, the operation was competent. Politically, it was a disaster. Financially, it was fatal. The United States opposed the intervention, and instead of arguing with speeches or threats, it applied pressure where Britain was weakest: the pound. American officials made it clear that if Britain continued the operation, financial support would be withdrawn. No emergency loans, no currency stabilization, no protection against a run on sterling. Markets reacted immediately. Confidence collapsed. The pound came under attack. Britain had no reserves to defend it. Within days, the government faced the prospect of a full currency crisis. Imports would stop. Food supplies would be threatened. The economy would seize. There was no choice. Britain withdrew. Suez was not just a diplomatic humiliation. It was the moment Britain learned, publicly and unmistakably, that it could not act independently of American approval. The empire had survived war, rebellion, and political change. It could not survive financial isolation. After Suez, the pace of withdrawal accelerated. Commitments east of Suez were abandoned. Bases were closed. Global ambitions were quietly scaled back. Not because Britain no longer cared, but because it could no longer pay. At home, the adjustment continued. Governments of all parties accepted the same constraint. Britain would live within its means. Growth would be managed. Risk would be avoided. Stability became the overriding goal. This was the final transformation. The empire had not been defeated. It had been priced out of existence. Victory in World War II had destroyed the margin of safety that once made global power affordable. From that point on, every attempt to behave like an empire produced a financial crisis. Every assertion of independence carried a price Britain could not pay. The war had been won, but it had quietly rewritten the limits of British power. And once those limits were exposed, the end of the empire was only a matter of time. By the end of the 1950s, the outcome was no longer in question. The British Empire still existed in fragments, but the system that sustained it was gone. What remained was a nation adapting to a smaller role, not by choice, but by necessity. The war had changed the rules. Before World War II, Britain could borrow to expand. After the war, it borrowed to survive. That difference defined everything that followed. Debt no longer financed growth. It financed continuity. It paid for food imports, fuel, and basic stability. It bought time, not power. Each year, more of Britain's income went to servicing past obligations. Less was available for investment, modernization, or global influence. The empire became a luxury Britain could not afford, even if it still wanted it. Decolonization accelerated, not because Britain suddenly lost interest in its overseas territories, but because the arithmetic made control impossible. Independence movements succeeded because Britain lacked the resources to resist them indefinitely. Force was expensive, administration was expensive, development was expensive, and none of it produced returns large enough to justify the cost. The most damaging consequence of victory was psychological. Britain had won the war at extraordinary cost. It believed that sacrifice would be rewarded with security and influence. Instead, it discovered that victory did not restore what had been spent. Power, once liquidated, does not magically return. The empire did not fall in battle, it expired in accounting offices. By the time the last major colonies gained independence, Britain had already accepted its new reality. It focused inward, it preserved social cohesion, it avoided catastrophe, but it no longer set the terms of the global system. That role had passed to nations whose industries were intact, whose currencies were strong, and whose balance sheets were clean. World War II did not defeat the British Empire. It made it unaffordable. The tragedy is that Britain did everything right militarily. It fought bravely. It endured. It won. But the price of that victory was the liquidation of the very foundations that made empire possible. Winning the war did not save the empire. It finished it.